Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining me tonight and coming here to talk all about pelvic floor health. This is my passion. Just for those of you who don't know me already, I'm a Pilates teacher. I've been teaching Pilates for about 15 years. I started specializing in pre and postnatal about 15 years ago, just because I found it really interesting. And then I went on to have my own kids. And because I've had pelvic floor issues myself, I've just become quite obsessed with pelvic floor health and get really, really good results with the work that I do with women and their pelvic floors. And so, just for a bit of background, as I said, I've been teaching for 15 years. I've lectured for the Pilates Foundation in pelvic floor health and women's health. I'm actually not anymore. I need to change that. Um, I was a faculty member for the Centre for Women's Fitness. But I am still one of their women's wellness specialist Pilates teachers. So I've done their trainings in the pelvic floor, in diastasis recti, pre and postnatal, menopause, and fascial release. As you can see, there's a huge list of stuff that I've done, but basically I've done loads and loads of training. I would think there's not many trainings that I don't know most of what they're talking about in them. I really, really have immersed myself in this for definitely the last sort of 5 years or so. And I'm not saying that I know everything at all. I definitely don't know everything, but I am a good place to come to kind of point you in the direction of people who do know as well. So if you feel like there's stuff that we haven't covered today, and if you have really specific questions, I might be able to help. But if I can't help, I will probably be able to send you to someone who can. So please do use me tonight and ask as many questions as you have. Put them in the chat. I'm not going to look at them as I go through all of this, but put them in the chat, and then at the end we'll stay and do a bit of a Q&A at the end. So the way that I work with pelvic floor health is based on a 5-step program, which was studied. Can everyone just mute themselves so there's no background? Sorry. I based everything that I do on a study that was done, I want to say in 2009, which was based around these 5 steps in pelvic floor health. And they had really amazing results from this study, but it's actually kind of, in a way, just what Pilates does as well. So they did this big study, but really a lot of it is just Pilates. So it starts with breathing. Breathing is really, really important when it comes to pelvic floor health because it hugely impacts how your core functions. And if your breathing patterns aren't optimal, if your breath doesn't move well through your torso, then it's really, really difficult for your pelvic floor and your core to work properly. So if you imagine that your torso is like a canister and you've got your diaphragm at the top and your pelvic floor at the bottom, and your pelvic floor and your diaphragm work together. If any part of that canister isn't moving properly, then that will impact what's going on in your pelvic floor. So with your breathing, for example, if your ribs are really stuck and therefore your diaphragm isn't moving properly, and it might be that you're then missing out on some kind of massage and movement in the pelvic floor. It might also be that your ribs aren't moving enough, so all of the breath is going down into your belly and putting too much pressure into your pelvic floor. So there's lots of different scenarios, but basically looking at and working on your breathing patterns, which is kind of one of the first main principles of Pilates, is really, really important when it comes to your pelvic floor health. Then they moved on to tonic activation, which is basically a Kegel, so the lift and squeeze that we are often told about when it comes to pelvic floor health. And my big passion is letting everybody know that while it is useful to separate your pelvic floor so you can say, yes, I can feel that that's doing something, Kegels and that tonic activation are a tiny piece for me of what pelvic floor health means. It's not that you shouldn't do them necessarily. Some people argue that you shouldn't. I think that they have their place and that they can be really useful. But the pelvic floor health is about so much more than just lifting and squeezing those muscles. If you think of any other muscle in your body, you would never say, oh, I want to strengthen my bicep, so I'm going to squeeze it and release it, squeeze it and release it. You would say, I'm going to add weight and I'm going to add movement, and you would do bicep curls, and that is what you would, it makes sense in that respect, that that's what's going to build up strength and build up the right movement that we want in our biceps. Your pelvic floor is no different. We need movement, we need weight, we need release in the pelvic floor. It's not just about strength. So the next step is muscle strengthening. And actually, I should put, this is what's in the study. I would actually put before that, releasing everything, which I'll come to again in a minute. But the next step in the study was muscle strengthening, where they did, again, basically Pilates exercises with these study groups to build up their global strength and their holistic strength, which again, I'll come to a little bit more in a minute. They then did functional expiratory patterns, which is basically something called the NAP, which is something that women's health physios teach. So if, for example, you sneeze, when you sneeze, you ideally, if you've got pelvic floor trouble, just give yourself a little bit of support from your pelvic floor just to stop that potential extra pressure, or the extra pressure that goes down to your pelvic floor. You're just supporting it a little bit better. And then right at the end, they added in impact activities, which is basically, the way that I see it is that what I teach is kind of building everybody up to be able to hopefully do impact activities without it being a problem. So things like running, jumping. You know, a lot of people come to me telling me that they want to go on the trampoline with their kids, but they can't, or they want to be able to run after their kids in the park, but they have that concern about whether their pelvic floor is going to support them and they're going to leak. All of the work that you do in those first 4 steps and that I do with people is all about getting you ready to do impact activities. And one thing that I'm really passionate about is kind of empowering people to know that it's quite unusual that you are never going to be able to do any kind of impact again. Sometimes there's a bit of a kind of myth around it all that, you know, if you've got a prolapse or, you know, once you've had a baby, you should just avoid impact work. It's definitely not the case. It may be that you shouldn't be, you know, running marathons or doing things that are, you know, going to put a huge strain on your pelvic floor, but it is possible. And most people don't want to do that. And the goals that most people have, you know, to be able to run in the park with your kids, for example, are quite achievable with the right support. So optimum pelvic floor function, and this is kind of where I'm going to stay for a little while, and I'm going to talk about a few different things. But one of the things that's really, really important is the balance between length and strength. So I mentioned already that the way that I work, I do a lot of release work, and I kind of try and get the whole body moving properly to make sure that the pelvic floor is then moving properly. If you think of any muscle in your body, if the tissues are really stuck and there's no movement in the muscle at all, then when you come to try and contract those tissues and build strength, it's just not going to work properly because the muscles are too stuck. So with your pelvic floor, it can be exactly the same. So if you spend a lot of time sitting, for example, if you've done a lot of exercise, sometimes there's sort of tension in your pelvic floor because you've been holding tension throughout your body. Like, you know, things like ballet dancers and gymnasts can sort of be holding themselves up a lot and cause tension in the pelvic floor. It can also, tension can creep in because of things like, I say creeping, can be kind of thrown in, but with things like episiotomy. So that's when you'll have a little cut around the vagina and into the perineum when you give birth, or if when you give birth, sometimes there's some tearing of the vaginal muscles. If you have a cesarean birth as well, that will impact all of the tissues that can then sort of lead to things not functioning as well as they can. So all of these different things can lead to tension in the pelvic floor. If your pelvic floor is tense, it will stop it from contracting properly. So that's another reason that things like Kegels, although they can be useful, for some people, they can actually make it worse, because if your pelvic floor is already tense and then all you're doing is tensing, and you're never finding that release, then your pelvic floor is just going to get really exhausted and not be able to do its job properly. So releasing the pelvic floor is really, really important, and making sure that you've got a balance between the length and the strength. The best way to find out whether your pelvic floor is too tight is to go and see a women's health physio and get an internal exam. And they can then, you know, if you've got an episiotomy scar, for example, they can do some scar tissue release on that scar and help the pelvic floor to just instantly function a little bit better. But then also, like in my classes, we do a lot of rolling on spiky balls and things. We do a lot of stretches, and we do a lot of mobilizing of the pelvis. You know, if your lower back's really tight as well, then because everything's connected, the tissues in your lower back that are tight can be sort of pulling on the tissues of your pelvic floor and stopping them from working properly. So, like I say, it's not just about squeezing, it's not just about strengthening, it's about good muscle function. And that means creating length in the muscle as well as being able to find that, that contraction. So I've already mentioned that to have a good muscle function, you also need a lack of restriction. So we want to work on things like scar tissue and adhesions. And like I say, there is, you know, a lot of people don't know that that support is out there. You can go and see women's health specialists. You can go and see scar tissue workers who won't necessarily, in fact, I would say probably don't do the vaginal release. But if you've got a cesarean scar, then they can release your cesarean scar, and that can make a huge difference to how your abdominals are functioning. Again, your abdominals and your pelvic floor are very, very closely linked. So when you come back to that canister again, if you think of this, in fact, I think I'm just going to turn off my screen share because I feel like it's more important that you can see me than you can see that. So when if you've got your canister, if this is the side of your canister and this is your pelvic floor, when you're breathing, your pelvic floor is moving down, your abdominals are moving outwards. And when that's happening, you need your abdominals to be working properly. The ideal way to get your pelvic floor to activate is actually not to lift and squeeze from your pelvic floor. It's to engage your abdominals, and that naturally will create a contraction in your pelvic floor. So for most people, unless you've been told by women's health physio that you need to be specifically doing those lift and squeezes, for most people, it's actually more effective just to focus on working your abdominals and just making sure that your pelvic floor is giving you that support underneath that. So don't be kind of fooled by this myth of Kegels and squeezing being the answer to everything. It really isn't. And it's about that sort of counterplay between all of the different parts of your canister. So as I mentioned before, your diaphragm moving down, your rib cage and your abdominals, and that all coordinating and working together is really, really important. So I always just mention the fact that sometimes it can sound as if by doing this kind of work on the pelvic floor and by finding those connections, you can sort all pelvic floor problems out. If you have problems with your nerve supply, it's going to be a whole different thing. And that should be picked up by your GP, by a women's health physio. But again, I just want to reiterate again and again and again how important it is to seek help. There is a lot of support available. It's not always super easy to find. It's not always super easy to access, but it is out there. But you will only get that support, and you will only find out, for example, if it is your nerves, which might mean that you need some kind of surgery if you go and see your GP. And I've got a stat in here later about how it's the average time it takes women to go and see their GP to get help for pelvic floor issues is about 6.5 years. And I just want to really encourage you not to leave it that long. The sooner you address any of these issues, the better. It's really, really like a lot of pelvic floor issues, if they were just nipped in the bud straight away, would not become the kind of big things that they can become if you leave it 6.5 years plus. And I think that potentially, I think that some people do wait a lot longer than 6.5 years. So another thing that's really important is coordination, which I've already touched on, but I'm just going to teach you a couple of little things to help improve and sort of start to work on the coordination of your pelvic floor. So you can do this sitting, but if you'd like to, and I would kind of recommend that if you can, and actually, Shorsha, don't do this lying down for pregnant people. You can do this sitting up if you're pregnant. But if you're not pregnant, then you can come and lie on your back. Bring one hand to your belly and one hand around your rib cage. And just take some breaths there. And just try and notice how that canister moves. So in an ideal world, as you breathe in, your breath will move into your rib cage, and then it's like the leftovers will come down into your belly. So just notice what goes on in your body. And it might be, I don't want you to panic about what's happening in your body right now. We're just starting to raise your awareness, and awareness is really the first step to changing anything. If you have no idea what what the sort of optimum situation is, then you're never going to get there. You don't need to be there today. So don't panic if you put your hands there and think, oh my God, my ribcage doesn't even move. There's loads you can do about that, but feeling it is step one. So take a few breaths there and try and get your ribcage moving as much as you can. And then notice how hopefully as you breathe out, your belly will just gently drop downwards. And then as you breathe in, it will let go. So on your next exhale, imagine like you're blowing out some candles and feel how hopefully you'll feel a sense of your abdominals gently drawing inwards. And then as you breathe in, your abdominals will relax again. And remember that relaxation is just as important as the contraction. So breathe into your rib cage and then breathe out. Blow out the candles and feel your belly drop gently down toward your spine. Now on the next one, just try and notice if you can feel that as your belly drops down and draws in, your pelvic floor will naturally, for the majority of people, your pelvic floor will naturally lift up with that action. So breathe in here, breathe out, blow out your candles, and try and feel an upward support coming from your pelvic floor. And it might be that you're just imagining that for now. Don't worry if you feel like you don't really know if it's happening. It's really normal to not be super connected to your pelvic floor. But again, that's where I'd really encourage you to go and get your pelvic floor looked at if you're not sure. Get support from a women's health physio because they can tell you exactly what's going on by looking at everything internally. So alignment is also really important. And this is, I mean, I could talk to you for an hour about alignment. So this is going to be a really quick run through as to how things ideally would be stacked. So in a perfect world, when we're standing, and let's just remember that we don't live in a perfect world. So you don't need to be exactly here. But in a perfect world, when we stand, our pelvis stacks over our ankles, our rib cage stacks over our pelvis, and our head stacks over our rib cage. And when you think about your pelvic floor, often there's a real focus on what's going on here. But if you think about your posture and how maybe you might be slumping forward like this and your head might be poking forward, you might be sort of collapsing down in your rib cage, think of all the pressure that creates going into your pelvic floor. So what we want is a feeling of lift and length away from the pelvic floor as often as possible. And this head position is really important because when your head pokes forward, like a lot of ours do, mine included, it adds extra pressure going downwards. It makes a really big difference. Like your head is really heavy and the weight of your head, depending on where it's stacked, becomes heavier basically. So if it's stacked in exactly where it should be, in that kind of perfect posture, then your head becomes lighter and less of a weight. If your head is coming forward, then it becomes a heavier weight for your pelvic floor to support. So it's not just about, you could have a really strong, well-functioning pelvic floor, but if your posture is putting loads of pressure down into it, then it's still going to be difficult for it to be fully doing its job. Then where your pelvis is also matters. So if you swing forward like that, for example, in your pelvic floor just doesn't support properly. We want the pelvis stacked right over your ankles. And my simple way of doing that is always just to lift your toes up and just see how that impacts where you are. Like, do you usually stand like that? And especially for new mums, if you're holding a baby, when you lift your toes up, that will just help you to get that support rather than this, which is such a common new mum posture and really doesn't help with what's going on in your pelvic floor. And I'm sorry, I know I'm giving you so much information here, but just one more thing, that the position of your feet also matters. So if your feet are turned out like this, then that will tighten up the back of your pelvis and tighten up the back of your pelvic floor. So ideally, we want feet in this position. And a nice, easy way to, and I say easy, but a straightforward way to do that is to strengthen your inner thighs. So that because when your inner thighs are stronger, they will come it will sort of pull your feet inwards, and to release all of the muscles out here that might be pulling everything out. So again, this is all stuff that we work on in Pilates. It's all, you know, it takes time, but it does, you can really make a huge change to your posture and to those habits that are quite difficult to break sometimes. So as I mentioned, it's really common for people to wait and to not address these issues. And these issues are really common. Like every time I run one of these webinars, I get, you know, at least 100 people signed up to them. I know there's not 100 people here, but there are almost 100 people signed up to it, because there are so many people that this is impacting. You're not on your own, and the support is out there. And it's also, you know, pelvic floor stuff isn't just for people that have had children. It's, you know, people that 80% of female athletes who don't have children report pelvic floor dysfunction. So it's really important to understand that if you have had children, particularly if you've had a difficult birth and you know that your pelvic floor was impacted by your birth, to be kind to yourself around high impact exercise. As I mentioned earlier, I would never suggest that you can't do it, but I would also say be kind to yourself about how much is possible in your body and how much you have time to support that exercise. So if you're doing high impact exercise, you need to be doing a lot of strength work alongside that. So action that you can take away from today is looking at your breathing mechanics, which we've just done very briefly, and I know it might have not felt like enough, but one more exercise that can be helpful is to use something like, I've got a yoga strap, but you can use like a dressing gown belt. Bring that around your rib cage, and then just try and push that away with your inhale. So breathe in, send the strap away, and then breathe out, and really, again, raise your awareness of those muscles and how your rib cage moves and how it works. Again, just raising your awareness of your posture and your movement habits. So just noticing day to day, do you always stand with your weight on one side? Do you stand with your pelvis swinging forward? Do you let your upper body collapse? Do you let your chin poke forward? All of those things, they might feel like, what's that got to do with my core? But hopefully, as I've kind of talked through the stacking, it will start to make sense as to why these things do really matter. You may have picked up on it already, but I'm very passionate about people accessing women's health physios and women's health specialist osteopaths, because they can make such a huge difference. Like, I really believe in what I do, but I know that the magic happens when you're doing the two together, and getting that extra support is just so, so helpful. Another thing that I haven't mentioned so far is toilet habits. So constipation has a big impact on your pelvic floor. So addressing constipation can be really, really important. And a really quick fix that I always say on these webinars is to get yourself a squatty potty, which is basically a little step thing that goes around the toilet, and that it changes the alignment of your legs when you're going to the toilet. So we were designed to poo in a squatting position. You know, for anyone who's ever had a toddler, when they do a poo in their nappy, they tend to squat down like that to do it, because in an ideal world, the alignment is that your knees are higher than your hips, whereas on a toilet, we sit with our hips higher than our knees, and it makes it harder, and it makes us have to push a little bit more to get the poo out. If you've got a squatty potty, or even just a pile of books next to your toilet with your feet on to raise your knees up, it will change the angle and just make it easier for you to poo. So especially if you have constipation, but actually for me, it's just like, just everyone get one, because why not? They're about £20, and it's just such an easy no-brainer, you know, to make your pelvic floor have to work a bit less hard. I'm a big, big believer in release. So I work with things like these spiky balls and these fascial release balls, which are kind of squidgy but a little bit hard balls, and just kind of massaging into your bum and massaging actually your whole body. So even like, for example, I mentioned about your posture, like if this is all really tight around here, you can use a spiky ball to massage and to just start to release your upper back. You can use it to massage into your bum cheek and release tension there. And the more kind of movement and give you get in your body, the better function you'll get when you move on to strength work. Strength work is super, super important. You know, that initial, we started on the exhale and connect to the abdominal muscles, which is kind of the foundation of everything that I teach and the foundation of basically good core function, really. And all of those little changes can make a really big difference before you even start to think about strength. And then am I gonna share again? No, I can't be bothered to keep going in and out. But basically, one of my big other things that I try and work around, like I like working with evidence-based stuff. Like, I know from my years of teaching that all of this stuff works, but because there are now studies to prove that it does, I base a lot of what I do around a study from 2016 where they chose 10 different movements and they studied all of them in relation to how they impacted pelvic floor contraction. And so it was how, if a Kegel gives you X amount of contraction, what increased percentage do all of these exercises give? And all of the exercises on this list of 10 gave a stronger pelvic floor contraction than a Kegel on its own. So it's not just me saying it. These exercises really do give a better workout for your pelvic floor than just the lift and squeeze. And going back to what I said at the beginning about you wouldn't try and strengthen your bicep by contract, release. You would always add weight and movement. So I'm just going to very quickly run through the list of 10 exercises that they gave on the thing, and I'm going to show you them, just a couple of each, so that you can walk away with the exercises. And actually, what I'll also do is when I do a follow-up email from today, I'll just put in, I've got a video that goes through them all properly so that you can take that away and use that if you need to, or if you want to. So the first one, sorry, I'm just going to make sure I can see myself so that I'm... so the first one is a lunge. So nice and simple. Step one leg out in front of the other, and then inhale to lunge down and exhale to push back up again. And the breath matters, because when you breathe in, your pelvic floor moves down. When you breathe out, it lifts back up again. So it's quite a standard exercise in most sort of forms of exercise, but when you coordinate it with your breath, it becomes a brilliant exercise for your pelvic floor. Number two is a squat. So again, thinking about the alignment of your legs, making sure that your knees don't roll in, send your thigh bones out, and then inhale to squat down and exhale to push up. And you can, sorry if this is a bit graphic, but if you put your hands on your sit bones at the bottom of your pelvis, you'll see that as you come down, they widen, and as you push up, they contract again. And that's what your pelvic floor is moving with that. So as you come down, it lengthens. As you push back up, it contracts again. And then I'm just going to see what number 3, 4, and 5 are so that I know what I'm talking about. So then you've got side lying exercises. So things like this, lift the leg and lower. And then with a straight leg as well, lift and lower. And these, again, give a stronger contraction than a simple Kegel. And then my personal favourite, which I teach this in every single class I ever teach, apart from pregnancy, because I don't put you on your backs, but every single postnatal class, I put a bridge into it, because this gives the strongest contraction. So peeling your spine up, peeling your spine down. And if you're doing this with me, you might be able to tune in to the fact that your pelvic floor will, you may not be able to feel it, but I can really feel my pelvic floor active as I do that. And that gives a 56% stronger pelvic floor contraction than a Kegel does. And then you've also got on all fours, toes tucked under, hovering the knees off the floor, which I only recommend doing once you've got a good connection into your abdominals. That can cause your tummy to push out if you're not strong enough. So I wouldn't recommend that to people who are newly postnatal. And then you've got things like single leg extensions and then cat-cow. And I love cat-cow because it's just such a nice exercise for everyone. And here you can really feel how the position of your pelvis changes what's going on in your pelvic floor. So as you breathe out, you tuck your pelvis under, your sit bones draw together, your pelvic floor lengthens. And then as you come into a flat back, your sit bones widen, your pelvic floor relaxes. So just gently rocking the pelvis forwards and back. And that, I'm just going to tell you what percentage that is. That gives a 41% stronger contraction for your pelvic floor than a Kegel on its own. So as you can see, there's lots that you can do as well as, or instead of even, but as well as Kegels. It's not just about that lift and squeeze. So that is the end of my presentation. Does anyone have any questions before we head off? No? Are you all good?
Thank you, Grace. Sorry, unaudied myself. That was really good. Thank you.
Oh, no worries. Thank you for joining me, everybody. And if anyone's interested in classes, I have stuff online, I have stuff in person. I've got a really great online 30-day challenge that I really recommend for new people if you haven't done anything before. It's quite cheap and easy to access. And I really love it. But I'm also on Instagram if you're not already there, and on my mailing list, which you will all be on now. So you will start to get emails from me about different things. I'm not particularly selling anything tonight. I'm just here to tell you stuff. But yeah, if you do want more, then just stay on the mailing list and you will get sent stuff all the time. And somebody said, do you do classes for pregnant women? Yes, I do. I have a pregnancy class in St Albans on a Wednesday evening, which has space at the moment. So do feel free to get in touch if you want to join that. And yeah, thank you for coming, everybody. And do let me know if anything comes up afterwards. I'll do like a follow-on email to everyone who was signed up with the recording and also with that video that I mentioned, so that if you wanted to start practicing some of the exercises that I very quickly went through tonight, you can use that video. So yeah, thank you for coming. I'll stay here till you all disappear, just in case anyone wants to ask anything that I've missed. But otherwise, in fact, I'll stop recording now.